All right, now let's move into another segment. This is where nostalgia stops being only about music and starts becoming a conversation about how people actually live. And today we are reacting to a really interesting video by Shaq Morgan. I highly recommend um for you to subscribe to his channel, Shaq Morgan's. I will leave it in the description and in the comments. And he's discussing the topic of the millennial midlife crisis. Jack often reflects on generational changes from the 80s, the 90s, and this last decade. And so it's interesting to grab his insights coming from a millennial, a younger millennial than myself, and then comparing those views with the 80s. This is a segment to reflect about the different times and the social changes. So let me know if you can. Let's hear about some seconds. I recommend you to go to his channel, to subscribe to his channel, and find this uh, video called "The Millennial Midlife Crisis."
You. But it's around that 27 to 29, 26 to 29 mark. Call it 27, where you go, oh my God, I'm going to be 30. And you know, when you're younger, and you're like 19, 20, you think 30, you're like basically dead. Well, at 27, when you, especially if you were like me, where you had nothing going on really, you kind of get nothing going for you. Um,
All right. Well, what caught my attention immediately about this video is that he reframes the idea of the midlife crisis into something much more psychologically accurate. He calls it a midlife awakening. And I think that distinction matters a lot because when people hear midlife crisis, they imagine sports cars, irrational decisions, impulsiveness, running away from responsibility. But what Chuck is really describing in this video is something much deeper. It's the realization that maybe for years even, you've been living almost entirely according to expectations. Being the reliable employee, the responsible adult, the stable partner, the productive person, while slowly losing connection with your own identity. And I think many people experience some version of this now, especially millennials. Let's have a look to a little bit of the context because millennials grew up during a really strange transition historically. They were still raised with many old expectations, such as study hard, work hard, buy a house, build stability, everything will eventually make sense. But then adulthood adulthood arrived during economic instability with the 2009 crisis, the and the internet overload, uh, social media comparison, housing crisis, career uncertainty, a burnout culture, and suddenly many people realized that the old roadmap no longer guaranteed emotional fulfillment. And that creates a very strange psychological state because many people continue moving forward externally while internally feeling increasingly disconnected. And one thing Chuck says in this video that really stayed with me is this idea that many people became expert at delayed gratification. And that's a very important psychological point because discipline is healthy, responsibility is important, sacrifice is part of adulthood. But sometimes people delay enjoyment for so long that eventually they forget how to actually feel alive. That happens to all of us, right? And I think many people listening right now probably recognize this feeling. If you keep telling yourself, um, okay, I will do it later, I will relax later, I will enjoy life later, I'll reconnect with myself later, I'll start living once everything is finally stable. But then years pass and the nervous system slowly becomes trapped in permanent survival mode. And modern culture rewards this behavior big time with constant productivity, constant optimization, constant pressure to turn yourself into a machine. And eventually, people wake up emotionally exhausted without even understanding exactly why. Now, another thing I found really interesting in this video is when Chuck talks about reconnecting with what he calls the 15 years old version of yourself. I think psychologically he's touching something very real here because for many people, teenage years were one of the last periods where they still allowed themselves to desire things freely before identity became heavily shaped by career expectations, social expectation from family or the close circle, financial pressure, fear in general, responsibility. And his example is skateboarding. Uh, He's still skating at 35 years old, still keeping part of that younger self alive with that sports and practice. I think what he's really talking about is preserving psychological vitality, not not refusing adulthood or not becoming irresponsible, but refusing to become emotionally dead. And that's a very important distinction because some people hear this conversation and think, oh, so responsibility don't matter anymore? No, that's not the point at all. Family matters, community matters, responsibility matters, of course, but also your inner world matters. Your curiosity matters, your passions matter, your sense of emotional aliveness matters, all of it. And this connects perfectly with why music nostalgia becomes so powerful emotionally. Because music often reconnects people with versions of themselves they temporarily lost. A song suddenly reminds somebody who they were, mm, who they were before burnout, or before routine, before emotional exhaustion, uh, before they became permanently worried about everything. And that's one reason I think nostalgia can become healthy or unhealthy depending on how people use it. And healthy nostalgia says, well, the past was perfect. But healthy nostalgia or conscious nostalgia, in the way that we use it here in this channel with the concept of positive nostalgia, that is the same as saying conscious nostalgia, says there are emotional qualities from the past I still want to preserve inside my present life. And that is one of the central ideas behind this whole show. So another thing Jack says that I really agree with is this idea that many people today live almost entirely in future-oriented anxiety. I think we all can relate with this, right? Always preparing, always anticipating, always worrying, always optimizing, always trying to secure the future. And psychologically, that creates chronic tension because eventually people realize they spent years preparing to live without actually feeling present while living. And I think modern life pushes people into this automatically. Even phones constantly push future-oriented thinking with notifications, emails, algorithms, deadlines, comparison, this fear of missing out. And one reason music still matters psychologically is because music forces emotional presence. At least for a few minutes, you simply feel. So I want to ask everyone in the chat or in the comment section if you're watching the replay, what's one thing you used to love when you were younger that you slowly abandoned because adulthood became too serious? And sometimes reconnecting with small forgotten passions matters more psychologically than people realize, actually. And I think one of the healthiest balances people can aim for is neither complete irresponsibility nor total self erasure through endless duty, being more dramatic, but something in between, being responsible while still protecting the parts of yourself that make life emotionally meaningful. Because eventually people don't only burn out from working too much. Sometimes we all burn out from abandoning ourselves for too long. And that's a very modern form of loneliness. All right, everyone. That was tonight's segment, Generations Reflecting on Lifestyles. And coming up next, we are moving into one of the deepest parts of the whole show, that is tools for these times, with my psychological tips using songs. But all this after our recess.